In fact, whenever a student comes to me and tells me, Professor Mazur, we've never done a problem like this before, I tell the student, look, if you had done a problem like this, it would, by definition, no longer be a problem. Think about it, right? You solve a problem once, it's no longer a problem. So I think education is really so much more. Yes, the information transfer is part of it, but it is important, and we give students the opportunity to develop the mental models, the interpretations, that will permit them to become successful citizens in society. And unfortunately, most of education is simply regurgitation of information, and then you wait 1 or 2 months, and you have the students regurgitate that same information back. I wish we had time to talk about assessment, because I think that is an important part too. My rallying cry for 2013 is, assessment is the silent killer of educational innovation. Okay, so thank you. So what is it that happened in my career? And you know, I wish I could show you the data, because they're hilarious. They show that some Harvard students in my classes didn't do much better than a gorilla pressing random keys at the keyboard. Seriously, but I don't have time to show you the data. What happened was that after teaching many, many years, convinced that I was a good teacher, I gave my students an assessment instrument that was really, really low level. It tested students' understanding of the concept of force, which I had done in the first week of my class. And I remember that when I gave it to my students, one student raised her hand right at the beginning. And that was the first warning sign. She raised her hand and she said, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught me, or according to the way I usually think about these things? I had no idea how to answer that question. And by the time that test had been completed, it was clear that my students had become very good at rote memorization and rote problem solving, but they did not even understand the most basic principles. And yes, I have to admit, physics is boring then. It is not very interesting. Okay, so it's not the transfer of information that is important, it's the assimilation of that information. Where did that happen for you? I've often asked myself that question. Where did the aha moments occur for me? Where did I go, oh, now I understand? Ask yourself that question. Where did it happen for you? Did it happen while you were sitting in a classroom, not very different from this one? I don't think so. It probably happened outside of the classroom. So I like to think of education as a two-step process. One, transfer of information. I mean, no transfer of information, no education, right? We all agree on that. But that's not enough. There's that second step, the assimilation of that information. Piaget would have called this accommodation of information. I'm using a simpler term here. Now, in the standard approach to teaching, step one takes place in class, and step two takes place out of class, left to the student on his or her own. If you ask yourself which of these two steps is the easy one, I think we'd all agree, especially in the 21st century, it's that first step. Isn't it ironic that in most of education, we focus on the easy part, leaving the hard part to the students on their own? Shouldn't we do this the other way around? Shouldn't we really focus on that second step? So back in the early 90s, I decided to switch this, or as you now hear all around the world, to flip this, to basically put step one out of class, so that in class I can help my students make sense of the information. apply the information, practice skills, rather than just memorize content. Now, there's a lot of discussion of how to do the first step. MOOCs and this and that and the other. I don't want to spend any time discussing that. I want to discuss the second part. If you've transferred information out of class, which is not at all that hard, then what do you do in class? Well, the answer to that question is not that new. It's very simple. Teach by questioning. Who said that first? Socrates, 2,000 years, and here we're in the 21st century, and we're still teaching by telling mostly. So I'll walk into class, and I'll ask a question. And after I've asked the question, I give my students a few minutes to think in silence. I do not allow them to talk to each other. After they thought about it, I call them. We could do hands on the chest like I just did, or we could use clickers, which started in my classroom in the mid-90s, or we could use a consumer-based device system like learning catalytics. And after they've called, I ask them to turn to their neighbor, to find a neighbor who has a different answer, and to try to convince their neighbor of their answer. I discovered this kind of by accident. Part because I didn't know much about education, part because I was actually trying to explain something to my students. I tried it in two different ways, something related to Newton's third law. I covered the board with equations. I'd given it the most brilliant explanation you could possibly imagine. And I could at once see from the faces of my students that they were totally confused. I asked if there was a question. They were so confused they could not articulate the question. You know how it is, right? If you're really confused about something, it's hard to articulate it. So in a moment of despair, I said, why don't you discuss it with your neighbor? I had 250 students in my classroom then. And something happened I had never seen before. All 250 started talking to each other. It became complete chaos in the classroom. They forgot about me in front of the classroom. What's more, in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I thought, how can it be? I've just tried for 10 minutes, and in 2 minutes they figure it out. But imagine you have two students sitting next to each other, John and Mary. Mary has the right answer because she understands it. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. Simply the force of logic. But, and this is the key point, Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned it. She still knows what the difficulties are that a beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur learned it such a long time ago, to him it is so clear that he cannot even understand why somebody doesn't understand it. It's what my colleague Steven Pinker calls the curse of knowledge. You know, it's kind of an ironic statement, right? Because you tend to think that the more of an expert you are, the more qualified you are to teach. But in a sense, I'm making the opposite argument. The more of an expert you are, the more difficult it becomes to teach the beginning learner. Because you've forgotten about your own struggles. What's more, because there are so many students talking to each other, they can each address each other's specific problems, rather than just the cookie-cutter approach of the instructor. Let me show you, so then after the discussion, what happens is that I poll them again, a second time, and usually the number of correct answers go up dramatically. If you get about 30 to 70% correct on the first poll, you can easily go to very large numbers in the second poll. If it's less than 30%, there are simply not enough students who know the right answer. If it's more than 70%, it doesn't make much sense to have them talk to each other because they're already on the right track. Then we wrap up with an explanation, either from me or one of the students, and we repeat from the start. And of course, the learning takes place during this discussion in the fourth step. Let me show you a little video clip of how this works in practice.